I want to first welcome to the stage Russ Walker, who's a member of the Menus of Change Scientific and Technical Advisory Council. Russ is also the Clinical Associate Professor of Managerial Economics and Decision Sciences at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. Now I can breathe. Russ helps companies develop strategies to manage risk and harness value through analytics. His latest book, From Big Data to Big Profits, Success with Data Analytics, is being published by Oxford University Press this year. And he's also the author of the text Winning with Risk Management, which examines the principles and practices of risk management through business case studies. His many case studies have been highlighted by the Harvard Business School Publishing, the Aspen Institute, PRMIA, and the Bank of England for Excellence in Teaching Risk Management. Russ also began his career with Capital One Financial, where he served as its corporate strategist. Welcome, Russ.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you at this conference, and especially wonderful to hear everyone's focused and interested on risk, because there are a lot of concerns, I think, in the food industry about it. I think Michael said those very well. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what risk is, particularly with an economic perspective. How do we view it in the world of economics and finance? And on that front, risk is really about making a prediction, and that's hard, right? That's hard mathematically, and that's hard from your business. If any of us could figure that out, we, of course, would all go have a hedge fund and make a lot of money off of that. But the fundamental role in risk management is preparing our organization for the future, those challenges that may come to the organization, and some of them may be unforeseen. Some, which are foreseen, do allow us an opportunity to measure and prepare. And I'd like to talk about some of those and some of those strategies. Now, some people look at risk and think it's really about volatility, particularly if you're in the food business and you say, well, the price of my ingredients might move, and volatility is an interesting measure. And when I think about this, I think about the most horrific day in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Probably many in this room remember that day in 1987, bigger than anything that happened in the Great Depression and anything even in our most recent recession of 2009. Was the single largest drop in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And I share this slide for a few reasons. It showcases visually, graphically I hope, these features of volatility. I think we look at this graph and we could all agree that the left and the right have some different level of bumpiness. And that level of bumpiness, if you would, or volatility, we could measure. In fact, we could prepare for that. And we could have inventory, and we could have dedicated suppliers, and lots of things that would help us overcome that kind of moderate variation, if you would. What's very troubling about this is this quantum change. That, of course, in one day, in a matter of minutes, the Dow Jones Industrial Average could fall precipitously. And this exact phenomena is at work in your industry in a very big way. It's happening right now. No water in California. Will we have enough, lettuce? Will we have enough eggs? Or what price will we have to pay for those? These quantum changes in supply and price are especially difficult to prepare for and especially difficult to predict. And so that offers, I think, a unique challenge to the food industry. I'll say a little personal story about this this day, if you don't mind. It's also about how we perceive risk. So probably, as many in this room, I wasn't old enough to drive. So typically for that period in my life, my grandmother picked me up from school. And I remember she said, well, the next Great Depression has begun. We're listening to the radio report of what was happening in New York. And it was fascinating to me because she examined that situation with the context of what happened to her and her generation in the 20s and 30s. And then naively, perhaps, as a teenager, I thought, well, that's not going to happen again. And so one of the issues that we have in risk that we have to be very cautious of is the perception of risk. And we have biases, we have filters, and those filters are our experiences. And so having lived through a depression or something like that, anyone from her generation would have rationally behaved in the same way and prepared for something much graver. And that actually is important in how you formulate your team, and how you look at those individuals that will help you assess risk. What are the industries, what are the experiences that they've seen, and someone who has in fact seen those kind of downturns can bring a perspective that's very valuable to an organization. Now, the economic underpinning of risk is surprisingly recent. I know that looks strange, 1921 is a reference, but Frank Knight's a very famous American economist. He's the father of the Chicago School of Economics. And he was the first to write an important paper that said risk is more than a measure of uncertainty. It's not a gambler's perspective, that it in fact involves economic and monetary gains and losses. And as such, he did mention that it had to be measured with probability. And this notion that we're predicting the future, of course, means that we have some imprecision. And Irving Fisher, who's a famous statistician and economist in his own right, in the 1920s, also said that probability is also an estimate. And this is really bad news, right? I mean, unfortunately, if you say, well, there's a 20% chance of drought or something like that, we don't really know the 20%, right? And that makes it especially hard for someone downstream of, say, a supplier of food to prepare. That best information already is flawed. Excuse me. Economically, profit is really tied to the operation of your enterprise, the risk. And so, some of the great work, economic work from Thune, shows us that really profit and risk are intertwined. And I mention this because when I talk to my MBA students, they'll say, well, professor, I've got this easy business. It just spits out money. It's like an ATM, right? There's no risk involved. So, well, there's a lot of risk. There's risk of competition. There's risk of regulation. There's a risk that your business model might be attacked by NGOs or customers or whoever that may be, right? So in any business, I would argue, especially those where you don't perceive risk, the risks that may exist are even more dangerous. And of course, Frank Knight ties together these in his paper. I'll just say a little footnote about Frank Knight. I love history, and I hope you do as well. He was a very difficult person to work with, apparently, as an academic. Brilliant as he was, he had 4 PhD students complete their study under him, and they all won the Nobel Prize in Economics. So if you're interested in a little bit about risk, there's a webpage dedicated to him, and I highly recommend it. I won't read all of this, but Robert Merton, one of our recent Nobel laureates, tells us that risk is everywhere. It's in all of the products, it's all of the business functions that we undertake. And when you think about your business has a commitment to a customer. It puts food into someone's body, but also you claim a profit. You have a profit function. And you need to be mindful of both of those and those businesses and threats that may, of course, bring risk to it. Now, when we think about measuring risk and trying to evaluate our position relative to it, there are a few things that we typically in the world of economics and finance examine. Something like the likelihood or the probability, right? And so this is where the assembly of scientists and experts that we have who could say, well, what is the probability of a drought or probability of contamination or something like that? They'll bring us best estimates for that. The next is the outcome. And as I said, probability may be especially poor in terms of our measurement. Surprisingly, outcome is not. And if somebody said, well, what happens to your business if you don't have chicken or you don't have beef or you don't have any other critical ingredient or your food makes people ill? I could actually, or probably any of us, could put some measurement to that in terms of damage to the profit function, damage to the brand, and of course liabilities that might come from that. And so when we look at risk, interestingly, we're really examining cost to the enterprise, profits that should be earned. The business of risk management largely is protecting your profit function, to protect what you have developed and grown so that in fact you can lay claim to those profits. And as such, we're really looking at how does the organization use information, how does it accept uncertainty, and then how does it absorb and process new information. One of the things that we frequently do as humans is we look for averages, we look for descriptions that help us, and averages are, in fact, our enemy in the world of risk management. They don't tell us enough about the variation. Oh, here we go. And Stephen Gould, a famous scientist, told us that we're embedded with a certain code to look for averages, but instead we should be really looking for variation. In the absence of information on variation, it's very difficult for us to make correct decisions. One of the areas that we see an enormous amount of risk is in so-called operational risk. And this is particularly true, I think, for food service companies. you're at an interesting intersection between suppliers, organizations that produce your ingredients, maybe even some that pre-process it, and then possibly to resellers or to consumers ultimately who ingest it and enjoy it. And so this poses risk from various directions. Your suppliers, of course, can impose price and supply risk. Your customers, as we now learn, may have lots of concerns about the ingredients that go into the food, demand information about that, and of course that poses a new risk. Those may involve regulatory bodies who say, no, you can't operate your business that way. You must do the following, or you may only do the following. One of the areas that I find especially challenging for companies, and this is not just in food service and production, but my history in financial services and other industries that rely on outsourcers. And I don't just mean outsourcers like somebody who takes your call in another country, but I might outsource my production. I might outsource my shipping, or might outsource even my manufacturing in some capacity. And any time I've interacted with a company who is a supplier, they have the outlook that I'm going to grow this account. I get this wonderful business, maybe with a financial services firm, or maybe with a food chain, and their goal is in fact to grow that account. And then when I speak to the person who's on the principal side, that bank, or let's say it's a food service network, well, they're thinking, hey, I outsource this so I can control the cost, so I can drive unit costs down over time. And I've always found this to be a very interesting economic conflict, because they're both working together and both helping each other, but they have different goals. And when I think about that, that conflict in goals means that they're going to view information differently and likely even share information differently. Your outsourcer, your supplier, is a part of your profit function. What they know about your supply is critical to how you earn your profits. They may elect, not because they're malicious or diabolical, but economically, just not to share certain pieces of information. That puts more burden on you, of course, to learn more about what they do in terms of your business. It leads to a few strategies. Some of these I've developed, and they're in my book. And when you think about this business of food, your strategies, in fact, parallel this very nicely. If I really buy a commodity, sugar, cocoa beans, something that I really have no care of its origin, but really it's very, very fungible, then I know a strategy like in the upper left, where I just purchase based on price, works perfectly well. However, if I have immense demands on suppliers, then a critical supply component leads me to a single supplier operation. And so we see this with large food chains that move internationally, companies like quick serve services, fast food industries that go to emerging markets that can't supply potatoes or beef, and then they develop their own farm supply, their own vertical integration, if you would. And that's, of course, very expensive. It means that in order for me to claim the profit associated with the meal, I have to own the farm. And so, that's another extreme example. I think somewhere in between is actually what makes sense. And that in between is that you build flexibility into your menu. You build flexibility into your business so that you're not reliant on one ingredient or one supplier. Now, the role of information, particularly in food networks, has a very interesting scale of time. And this is a really wonderful slide that Arlen put together some years ago, and work that we've done with Menus of Change at Kellogg has referenced this over the last 3 years. When you think about the food industry, what will happen next week or in the next few days, we're either well-informed or we're well-prepared. And so it's not generally that we're concerned about the supply that we'll have in the short term. It's rare that that's the case. And then, of course, we have scientists who are warning us of things that will happen in many years, 5, 10 years, climate change and other things, although it may not be obvious what our actions should be, at least those risks are identifiable. What's most troubling, surprisingly, is what's happening in between. Those things on the order of a couple of years or so. What will happen next year with eggs? What will happen next year in California? And right, so many businesses look at that and say, I don't know. How do I prepare for that? How do I find substitutes for that? We have embarked on looking at a few of these aspects of the food supply, and started with some of the biggest pieces. One of them is the production of corn here in the U.S. And so approximately 13 billion bushels of corn is produced in the U.S. This graph demonstrates the breakdown of where that corn goes. Most of it goes into the production of animals and on ethanol being the largest source, and then cattle being the single largest use of corn from a livestock perspective. We've heard so much about red meat in this conference to suggest that there are various reasons that we should examine it, perhaps economically some reasons as well. So we embarked on examining the relationship between corn and beef prices. And so in this graph, beef is in blue and corn is in red. And we looked at this since 1990, and you can see some interesting behaviors. Price of beef fell precipitously in that decade of the 90s. It rose dramatically associated with globalization after 99. And then in 2007, associated with ethanol policy, excuse me, became very sensitive to variations in the price of corn. And both corn and beef rose coming out of the recession in 2009. And then interestingly, most recently, we have the price of beef increasing and the price of corn falling, largely corn falling associated with the decrease in price of petroleum around the world. And so you think about this and you're like, wow, how could these things be all interconnected? And of course they are. And so that burden, that understanding, if your business is beef or anything that is related to this, of course you have to overcome that and become aware of that. Some closing thoughts, and we don't have enough time, of course, to examine all of this, but the first is to begin to measure your business. Variation in profit, variation in your supplier, variations that come from your customers. Look for those things that may produce quantum changes, and of course focus on critical ingredients and suppliers, and not just because of the health benefits, which of course are significant, but also look for substitutes and flexibility in your supply chain, because it will indeed bring you better tools for risk management. And I think the slide on beef shows that we will expect a tremendous rise in the price of commodities, food prices associated not with our activity in North America, but largely the emerging global middle class internationally. So with that, there are any other topics that you're interested in, here are some of my books on those, but real pleasure to be with you guys. Thank you.